Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, let me softly take your hand and walk with you into the distant mists of the past, where time drifts like fog through crooked alleyways, where cobblestone streets whisper secrets, and life unfolds not in grandeur, but in silence, shadow, and sorrow. Make yourself comfortable now, breathe in deeply, let your mind settle, because this evening, I want to tell you a story that doesn't often get told. It's not of kings and queens, or gleaming swords and gilded thrones. No, this is about the forgotten, the lost, those who drifted unseen through the cracks of medieval society. This is the tale of what it truly meant to be homeless in the Middle Ages, and trust me, it was far from romantic. Let us begin. The wind blew cold that spring morning. It wasn't winter, but the frost still lingered on the breath of the trees. A boy, no older than 14, stirred beneath the rotting awning of a butcher's stall, curled beneath his woollish cloak, if one could call it that. It was no more than scraps tied together with twine. His name had once been Thomas, just Thomas, no surname, no lineage, no home. He woke not with a stretch, but with a start. The butcher's boy was coming with a broom. Thomas had learned to rise before the sweep or risk bruises on the ribs. You see, being homeless in medieval times meant you were not just poor, you were invisible. Or worse, you were vermin, scum to be driven away. And that's if you were lucky. There were no shelters, no food lines, no charity halls that welcomed with smiles. Charity existed, yes, in sermons, in the church. But in practice, it was a coin tossed from a safe window, a crust flung to the ground, a muttered prayer as you passed by. Thomas once had a mother. Her eyes were tired and her hands stained with dye from the cloth she used to stitch. She made tunics, simple ones, for simple folk. But when she fell ill, there were no doctors to call. Only the leech and his oils and a priest who offered prayers that tasted of stale wine and inevitability. After her death, the room was taken. The landlord, a man who wore fur even in summer, said children without parents were a nuisance, a fire hazard, a liability. He used many words Thomas didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. By nightfall, Thomas was on the street. Now in the bustling heart of a medieval town, life was vibrant if you were part of it. Bakers cried out their wares. Blacksmiths hammered iron into tools, into weapons, into purpose. Markets clanged with the sounds of bartering and the tang of spice and smoke. But all of it blurred past Thomas. He became a shadow, something people glanced at and then forgot, like an itch that fades. Hunger gnawed first at the stomach, then at the mind. It made him forget what bread felt like on the tongue, what warmth tasted like. He learned quickly to steal, not out of malice, but out of survival. A shriveled apple here, a crust of pie discarded by a passing squire. It was a dangerous game. If caught, the punishment wasn't light. There were stocks, there were lashes, and worse. But he had to try. Starvation in the Middle Ages was not poetic. It didn't come quietly. It wasted the limbs, hollowed the cheeks, clouded the thoughts until you couldn't remember your own name. And yet, Thomas was one of many. Homelessness wasn't a rare disease in those times. It was a thread woven deeply into the fabric of society. Wars took fathers, famine took mothers, plagues took entire families. One day you had a cottage and a pig and a garden full of leeks, and the next, silence. Smoke, an empty bed. The laws didn't help. In fact, they made it worse. There was a word used often, vagrant. It sounded so neat, so official, but it carried the weight of suspicion and contempt. Vagrancy meant you weren't working, and in a world where labour defined your worth, that made you a threat. The authorities didn't ask why you were homeless. They didn't care if your village was burned or your family buried. If you wandered without purpose, you were presumed dangerous. A thief in waiting, a lazy soul, or worse, a heretic. Some towns posted signs, no beggars beyond dusk. Others allowed paupers to stay only if they wore a badge, a piece of cloth that marked them as deserving of charity. But not everyone could get one, and not everyone wanted one. It was a brand, a scar stitched in fabric. Thomas wandered, from one village to the next, sleeping in churchyards when he could, for the church was the only place sometimes that offered a semblance of protection. But even there he was not welcomed, just tolerated, a ghost beneath the eaves. There were whispers sometimes of groups who lived in the woods. Outlaws, some said, families who had lost their land, their homes, and chose the wild over scorn. Thomas dreamed of finding them, of being among others like him. But the woods were cruel too, full of wolves and worse, men who preyed on the weak. And still, he walked. He wasn't always alone. There was Marjorie for a time, an old woman with a bent back and a voice like wind through reeds. She taught him how to find edible roots, how to barter a found trinket for a sip of mead. She called him child, though her own were long gone. She told stories softly beneath the stars of better days, of her youth and the laughter she used to know. She died in her sleep one night, wrapped in the rags they shared. Thomas sat beside her until the sun rose, not knowing what to do. No one came, no one asked. He buried her with his bare hands near a crumbling stone wall and whispered a prayer he barely remembered. He grew older, leaner, harder, and yet part of him remained that boy beneath the butcher's stall. The truth is, being homeless in the Middle Ages didn't mean just a lack of shelter. It meant a lack of safety, of identity, of existence. There were no documents to say who you were, no records, no guarantees. You were a leaf on the wind and the world blew cold. Thomas's story is one of thousands, but it is where our story begins. So rest now, gentle listener. We've only just stepped into the shadowed alleyways of a forgotten age, and many tales still linger in the dark. Close your eyes if you'd like, and when you're ready, we'll continue. The rain came slowly at first, a fine mist that kissed the cobblestones and clung to Thomas's hair like forgotten tears. He stood beneath the warped eave of a crumbling tavern wall, arms folded, eyes half shut. The air smelled of old ale, wet straw and distant fires. Spring had not yet arrived in full and the cold had not yet relented. His fingers ached, not from injury, but from living. The sort of deep ache that sank into the bone, not painful but constant. A reminder of the life he was living, or perhaps the one he had lost. By now he was taller, a little older, perhaps 16. His face had thinned, sharpened, but the same distant look still haunted his eyes, as though he was always halfway somewhere else. He had long since learned not to cry, not because he wasn't sad, but because crying meant people noticed. And in the world he inhabited, being noticed could mean danger. That morning, Thomas had eaten a crust of barley bread, stolen from a windowsill while the baker stepped into the back. The bread was hard, near stale, but he chewed it slowly, savouring it like a nobleman might a roast duck. He had wandered to the edge of town by midday, where the fences grew fewer and the land opened up into the old road, a stretch of beaten dirt that wound into the woods. It was there, near a ditch lined with reeds and crickets, that he met the boy. The boy's name was Jory. He was smaller than Thomas, with a quick grin and clever fingers that danced even when still. He wore a tunic patched with cloth of different colours, not out of fashion but necessity. Jory didn't ask where Thomas came from, and Thomas didn't ask either. They were both the same kind of stranger. "I sleep behind the cooper's yard," Jory said, plucking a reed and chewing it absently. "There's a pile of sawdust that stays dry if you lie real still. You want to try it?" Thomas followed. He had learned not to trust easily, but Jory had the look of someone who knew how to survive. That was a valuable thing, a trait that glimmered brighter than kindness. Behind the cooper's yard, they burrowed into the damp pile of curls and shavings, warm beneath the thin breath of moonlight. Jory told stories in a hushed voice, almost too soft to hear. Stories of sneaking into the fairgrounds, of stealing gooseberries from a merchant's daughter. Tales embroidered with exaggeration and boldness. Thomas listened, eyes open to the stars. That night they were not alone. From the darkness of the alley, another figure emerged, a man tall and bent, cloaked in layers that stank of age and mildew. He didn't speak, just crouched near the far end of the yard, coughed once, then curled into a ball and vanished into sleep. Jory whispered, "That's Brother Pelham. He was a monk once, or maybe just says he was. Talks to birds. I've seen him give crumbs to sparrows like they were royalty." They shared the sawdust pile for 3 nights. In that short stretch of time, Thomas learned how to mend a torn tunic with a sliver of bone, how to speak to a merchant's apprentice without sounding like a beggar, and how to tell when someone was about to turn you into the reeve. But he also learned something else. The world of the homeless in the Middle Ages wasn't entirely empty. Beneath the surface, below the bustling towns and markets, there was an invisible thread that stitched together the forgotten, a quiet network of nods, glances and unspoken rules, a hidden order, a A crust was shared, not out of pity, but because one day you might need it returned. A hiding place was never spoken of aloud, but the silence around it meant safety. When one found a well with clean water, they would mark it subtly. A piece of cloth tied to a low branch, a stone placed purposefully by the path. Thomas learned to read those signs. He and Jory travelled together for a while, from one village to the next, always staying just ahead of the law and just behind the plague. The great sickness hadn't returned in full, not yet, but whispers travelled faster than carts. In one town, they found 3 houses boarded from the outside. In another, a priest stood atop a barrel shouting that sin had taken root and that no one must leave or enter. They left. The roads were not kind. Some nights they slept in ditches, others in abandoned barns where rats scuttled across their feet. Once they found shelter in an old wayside chapel, long since forgotten by pilgrims. The roof was mostly gone and the altar had collapsed beneath ivy, but it was quiet, peaceful even. There, by the flicker of a stolen candle, Jory revealed the bundle he kept wrapped in oilskin. Inside, a wooden comb, 2 iron buttons, and a scrap of parchment with writing neither of them could read. "It's from my mum," Jory said, voice low. "She gave it to me before the cart took her to the pest house." He didn't say more, and Thomas didn't ask. Silence was part of the unspoken pact. They stayed in that chapel for 5 days, trading a small trinket Jory had carved, a tiny sparrow made of whittled oak, for a bowl of pottage from a kind widow. The old woman didn't smile, didn't speak, just handed them the bowl, turned and closed the door behind her. And then, just like the wind shifts, everything changed. It was a clear morning, birdsong thin on the air. Jory went to the nearby stream to rinse their bowl. Thomas stayed behind, stretching beneath the sunbeams that trickled through the broken roof. He remembers the scream, sharp and sudden, like a bone breaking. He ran. By the water, he found Jory on the ground. 2 men loomed nearby, one holding a cudgel, the other rifling through Jory's pouch. "You little thief," one spat. "You've taken from my cart, haven't you?" Jory tried to speak, but the blow came fast. Another scream. Thomas didn't think. He lunged, a stone in hand, striking one across the brow. The man stumbled, blood, shouting, and then Thomas ran. He didn't look back. He ran until his lungs burned, until the forest swallowed him whole, until the sun dipped and the night crept close. When he finally stopped, he collapsed beneath a tree, heart pounding, body trembling not from exhaustion, but from the cold hand of guilt that wrapped around his chest. He didn't know if Jory had lived, didn't know if he'd ever see him again. He was alone once more, only now the world felt colder, harsher. And the silence around him was no longer peaceful. It pressed inward like the walls of a coffin. But Thomas did not cry. He rose the next morning and walked toward the smoke of a distant village, because that's what you did when you had nothing left. You walked. The village came into view just as dusk painted the sky in shades of ash and gold. A curl of chimney smoke marked the boundary where wilderness gave way to men, not with grandeur, but with the quiet fatigue of another day ending. Thomas lingered at the edge of the trees. This place was larger than the others he had passed through. The houses were stone at their base and timbered above, their roofs of thatch bound so tight that even the wind seemed to whisper its respect. Chickens scratched lazily in the dirt, and somewhere beyond, the faint bleat of a goat sang its lonely lullaby. He waited until the last bell from the church tower rang, the one that told the townsfolk it was time to retreat indoors, to shutter the windows and bolt the doors. That's when Thomas moved, quick and quiet, toward the alley behind the tanner's shop. The smell was foul, of course, acrid and pungent with the sting of urine and lime, but it was dry. That was enough. He pressed himself into the corner, arms tucked beneath his ribs, eyes open just a little, and he listened. Every town had its rhythm, and Thomas had grown adept at learning them, the sounds people made when they were not being watched. A whispered conversation, the creak of a cart's axle, the heavy tread of the night watchman's boots. These were the sounds that told you where to step, when to run, and who might offer a scrap without expecting your soul in return. He was asleep before he meant to be. Exhaustion swept over him like a slow tide, and dreams folded into the darkness. In his dream, Jory stood in the stream again, but this time he wasn't bleeding. He was smiling, holding out the carved sparrow in both hands, its wings gleaming as if dipped in firelight. Thomas reached for it, but his hands were too heavy, his limbs too slow. He awoke to shouting. At first, it wasn't clear whether it was real or just the echo of dream noise, but then came the stomp of boots, the bark of a dog, the slamming of a wooden gate. Thomas sat up, heart hammering. He stayed still. Outside, a voice called out, sharp, clipped, and angry. "Another thief's been through the grain store. Bastard took half a sack this time." The dog barked again, closer now. "Check the alleyways. If he's sleeping off his fill, he won't get far." Thomas didn't breathe. The air in his lungs felt like fire. There was a space, barely more than a gap, between the tanner's shed and the wall behind it, just wide enough for a desperate boy. He slid into it, pressing himself tight against the rough stone, nose filled with the reek of dried hides and rotting leather. The dog came within seconds, a low growl rumbling through the darkness. Boots followed, but then a different voice. Older, wiser, calm. "If he's here, he's not gone far. We'll find him come light." The boots withdrew. The dog was leashed. Silence returned. Thomas waited another hour before crawling out. He moved with the patience of moss, slow, deliberate, without sound. He would not stay in this village. It was too alert, too watchful. And besides, he'd seen the way people looked over their shoulders here. Fear hung in the air like mist. Before leaving, he found the chapel, small, square, and cracked with time. The door was not locked. Inside, a single candle still burned before a wooden cross. He didn't pray, not aloud, but he stood there staring at the flicker, wondering if God watched boys like him, wondering if he had ever looked away. He took nothing. By morning, he was already down the road heading east. The roads between towns were not kind to travellers. Merchants rode in groups, armed and ready. Nobles rode high and fast with no pace for those on foot. But the homeless, they were the ones who truly walked the road. They travelled by night, rested by day, and learned the language of hedgerows and ditches. It was on such a road a week later that Thomas met Sister Winfrieda. She was old, older than anyone he had ever spoken to. Her skin folded like worn parchment and her eyes were milky with age. But her voice was clear, her hands, though gnarled, were steady. She found him by a ruined bridge where he had been picking through a pile of discarded cloth. "You'll catch your death wearing tatters like that," she said. Thomas flinched, unsure whether to run or speak. But she smiled. "I'm not here to take you anywhere, only to offer bread." From the satchel at her side, she pulled a small loaf, rough, dark, heavy with grain. She handed it to him as though it were a relic. He took it. But before he could run, she said, "Do you know of the Lazar house?" He shook his head. "It's just up the hill, abandoned now, mostly. Used to take in lepers before the last plague. But the monks are gone. What's left is peace. You're welcome to rest there." She didn't wait for an answer. She just walked on, her staff tapping rhythmically against the stones. Thomas watched her vanish over the hill. He stayed there until nightfall, gnawing at the bread like a starving dog, and when the stars rose, he followed the path she had taken. The Lazar house was nothing more than 3 buildings and a crumbling wall, cloistered behind a veil of thistle and moss. The chapel roof had fallen in, and the dormitory smelled of damp wood and old sickness. But it was quiet, and it was his. Over the next days, Thomas cleaned what he could. He stacked firewood, cleared the dead leaves, and built a small place for himself beneath the altar stones. There was a well that still drew water, cold, sweet, and clear. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas allowed himself to breathe. He lit no fires, he sang no songs, but he sat in the sunlight when it came, and he watched the birds that nested in the rafters. There was peace, until one morning he heard voices. Not angry, not searching, just talking, 2 of them. A girl and a boy. Young, careful. Thomas stood behind the chapel door, listening. "They say it's haunted," the girl whispered. "Nonsense," said the boy. "It's just old." The girl gasped. "There's someone here." Thomas stepped into the light. Not because he wanted to, but because something inside him, something old and worn, asked to be seen again. The girl took a step back. She was his age, maybe a year younger. Her hair was tied in twine and her hands were stained with ash. The boy reached for a stick, more startled than angry. "I won't harm you," Thomas said, voice raw from disuse. They stared at him, uncertain. And then the girl said softly, "We thought it was empty." "It was," Thomas replied. She hesitated, then reached into her satchel and handed him something wrapped in cloth. He opened it. Apples. 3 of them, bruised but whole. He didn't ask their names. They didn't ask his. But they came back the next day. And the one after that. And in the crumbling bones of the Lazar house, something new began to grow. Something Thomas had nearly forgotten how to feel. Something like hope. The days that followed passed not like a march, but like a hush. Soft, indistinct and slow. In the forgotten remains of the Lazar house, time seemed reluctant to move. The sunlight dappled through the broken rafters with gentleness, and the wind, though cold, no longer bit. It merely passed over as though it too remembered something sacred about the place. Thomas learned their names on the 4th day. The girl was named Unwind. Her voice was calm but carried with it the firmness of someone who had never been coddled. She moved with grace, barefoot even over stones, and always seemed to know where to step. Her brother Osric was leaner, hungrier, and more suspicious. He spoke less, watched more, and often walked behind her as though he were her shadow. They brought him food when they could. Old cheese, oatcakes, a turnip once, dug fresh from their own garden. Anwen never made a show of it. She would simply place the food beside him and speak of other things. The clouds, the smell of mint near the stream, the strange crow that always perched atop the crumbled tower. Osric was slower to speak. He eyed Thomas as one might watch a flame, with the knowledge that warmth and danger could come from the same source. But he softened slowly over shared silences and the crackle of twigs beneath their feet as they walked the edge of the woods together. They never asked where Thomas came from. He was grateful for that. People who asked about the past rarely understood that not every story wanted telling. Instead, they asked what he knew. "Can you fish?" Osric once asked. Thomas nodded. "Only with thread and bone. Hooks are hard to come by." "Can you find mushrooms?" "Some, enough to know which ones kill." Anwen smiled at that, not with amusement, but with a quiet sort of respect. They began to treat the Lazar house not as a ruin, but as a refuge. Thomas taught them how to strip bark from certain trees and boil it into a bitter tea that kept the gut steady. In turn, Anwen showed him how to mend a shoe with twine and nettle cord. She was nimble with her fingers and knew a dozen ways to knot a thread without it slipping. Osric shared little, but when he did, his words were sharp as flint. "People say you shouldn't trust those who sleep outdoors," he said once. "They're not wrong," Thomas replied. "But they also say we shouldn't come here." "To a place of the sick," Osric nodded. "Fear makes easy ghosts of stones," Thomas said. It became their saying. Whenever a branch creaked or a door shifted in the wind, Anwen would whisper, "Easy ghosts," and they would all grin, not out of bravery, but defiance. Together they made something of the space. A hearth from a broken fire pit, a bench from splintered pews. Thomas even uncovered a rusted lantern buried in the leaves, and with oil from pressed nuts and a borrowed wick, brought it back to life. The days turned cool, not yet autumn, but the nights whispered of it. One evening, Anwen arrived alone. Her steps were slower, her hands empty. Thomas saw it in her eyes before she spoke. "They came to our home," she said, voice thin. "The Reeve and 2 men from the manor." Thomas waited. "They said we'd been hoarding, that we hadn't paid the tithe." Thomas didn't need to ask. He understood the rhythm of such accusations. When a village went lean, someone had to bear the guilt. A poor family living near the edge of the woods, quiet and unseen, they were always easy to blame. "They took our goat," she said, "our tools, and Osric." She didn't cry. She sat on the chapel floor, legs folded, back straight, and stared at the altar as though expecting judgment from the rotting wood. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. He simply sat beside her. Eventually, he whispered, "Do you know where they took him?" Anwen shook her head. "The manor jail, maybe, or the cart to the Reeves' court. They said we were thieves." Thomas felt a heat rise in his chest, not of anger, that would come later, but of memory. The ache of being called criminal by those who never knew hunger. That night, the Lazar house held its breath. They didn't sleep. The candlelight flickered over the walls as Anwen traced shapes in the dust with her finger. Spirals, loops, the curve of a crescent moon. Thomas stared at the lantern, watching its flame. He remembered Jory, remembered Marjorie, remembered the priest who once muttered a prayer over his mother's body with eyes glazed from wine. He was tired of remembering. In the morning, he rose before the sun. Anwen was asleep at last, curled on the chapel's wooden floor. He placed his cloak over her shoulders and stepped out into the damp grass. He had seen the manor before, from a distance, high on the hill above the village, with its stone archway and its banners that flapped like the tongues of liars. He knew it would be guarded. He knew there would be locks. But he also knew something else. Every wall has a crack. He approached the village cautiously, hood drawn, feet bare for silence. He circled the manor grounds for hours, waiting, watching. The guards changed at noon. A cart arrived from the fields. Through the slats of the cart's frame, he saw Osric. Dirty, bruised, wrists bound, he was alive. That night, Tomas returned to the Lazar house, face drawn, clothes damp with dew. Anwen was awake before he spoke. "I saw him," he said. She didn't answer, but her hands tightened into fists. "I can get him out," he added. Anwen blinked slowly, as though waking from some deep, bitter dream. "How?" she asked. Tomas didn't smile. He didn't make promises, but his voice, quiet as ever, held something different now. Not hope, not yet, but something stronger than fear. "I've learned how to disappear," he said. "Now I'll learn how to return." That night, as the wind curled through the open chapel walls, they sat close together, whispering plans beneath the sound of owl feathers and the low groan of timber. The Lazar house, once silent as a tomb, now pulsed with the breath of rebellion. And for the first time, Tomas did not feel like a shadow. He felt like someone who could be seen. The night before they moved, the Lazar house was quieter than usual. The birds had gone from the rafters. The wind no longer whistled through the broken stones, but moved softly, like a breath taken in before a long exhale. Tomas sat outside, sharpening a rusted nail against a flake of slate. It wasn't much, not a weapon, not truly, but it was something to hold, something with a point. Anwen knelt by the well, cleaning a small cloth that once belonged to her mother. She said nothing, but her fingers trembled in the water, and the cloth moved like it didn't want to be clean anymore. Neither of them slept. When dawn broke, the sky hung low, pressed with cloud. No rain yet, just the threat of it. The manor sat high above the village, its grey towers squat and severe, its windows like watching eyes. Once, Tomas would have feared such a place, but now it simply looked tired, as if even stone could feel the weight of its own cruelty. They split at the base of the hill. Anwen walked with a bundle of firewood on her back, face dirty, eyes downcast. A servant girl, a nobody. Someone who might knock on the back gate of the manor and ask to trade wood for bread. Someone who would not be remembered. Tomas took the orchard path. He had found the gap in the wall 2 days prior, where the roots of an old pear tree had pushed the stones just far enough apart. A boy might squeeze through, a hungry boy. A forgotten boy, the sort no guard would ever suspect of being brave. He slid through like water and landed on the moss beyond with barely a sound. The manor courtyard was half asleep, the servants busy with barrels and buckets, chickens pecking beneath carts. Tomas knew better than to move fast. He stepped with care, ducking behind barrels, slipping into shadows cast by the stables. He'd memorized the layout from his time watching. The jail was little more than a cellar beneath the hall, a stone room with an iron-barred door and a single torch that burned low on the far wall. The key, he knew, hung in the kitchen, on a hook beside the cured hams. He'd seen it once when a cook stepped out with slop for the pigs. It took him longer than he hoped to reach it. The kitchen was warm and loud with voices. A woman laughed as she stirred something thick and steaming in a pot. A boy about Tomas's age scrubbed turnips. The door stood open and no one looked up. He crept in, silent as breath, eyes on the hook. The key was there. He took it. It was heavier than he expected. Cold in his palm, the teeth jagged like a bite. Slipping out was harder. Someone shouted behind him, though not at him. A spilled sack of barley. He used the chaos to duck through a side door, pressing his back against the wall as footsteps hurried past. Then he was in the cellar. The door creaked, but only a little. Inside, it was dark and damp. The smell of mould clung to the stones, and in the corner, beneath a narrow window that barely let in light, sat Osric. He looked worse than Tomas remembered, one eye swollen, his lips split, but his breath was steady. When he looked up, it took a moment for recognition to bloom, and then, slowly, his face changed, not into a smile, but into something steadier, something like belief. Tomas didn't speak. He knelt, inserted the key and turned. The click echoed like thunder. They moved fast, back through the cellar, through the stables, past the stone trough. Tomas led, Osric stumbling behind, weak but walking. No one saw them, or if they did, they didn't raise a voice. Perhaps they looked like scullery boys, perhaps they looked like nothing at all. The orchard wall was close. Then they heard the shout. A servant, or perhaps a guard. Tomas didn't stop to see. He shoved Osric through the crack in the stones first, then slid after, scraping his shoulder, but not caring. Behind them, footsteps approached. They didn't wait. They ran. Through the orchard, past the fence, into the trees. Their lungs burned. Osric stumbled. Tomas pulled him up. Behind them, no one gave chase. But they didn't stop running until the roof of the Lazar house came into view. Its broken cross tilting skyward like a crooked finger pointing towards something long forgotten. Anwen was waiting at the edge of the grass. She didn't cry. She ran to her brother and wrapped him in her arms, holding him like something she feared might vanish again. Tomas stood back. He felt the trembling in his legs now, the ache in his ribs. But he didn't sit, not yet. Osric pulled away, just slightly, and looked at Tomas. "You came for me," he said. Tomas nodded. "I said I would." The next day, the sky finally gave in. Rain fell hard, drenching the trees and the crumbling stones, soaking the earth around the Lazar house until it smelled of moss and ash and renewal. Inside, they lit the lantern. Osric lay on the pallet of straw, half asleep. Anwen mended a tear in her cloak. Tomas sat near the hearth, coaxing flame from the last of the dry kindling. None of them spoke for a long while. When they finally did, it was not of the manor, or the jail, or the men who had taken too much and offered nothing. They spoke instead of the things they could build. "We need more wood," Anwen said. "A rain catcher," Osric murmured. "A door that closes," Tomas added. Little things, small dreams. But in a world that had taken so much, dreaming was the bravest act of all. Later, as the fire hissed and the night settled in around them, Tomas lay awake and listened to the soft breaths of his companions, not brothers, not family, but something close, something he had thought long lost. The rain washed over the stones outside, and for once he'd not feel the cold. The days grew shorter. Where once the sun lingered on the horizon like a watchful eye, now it slipped quickly behind the hills, surrendering the sky to dusk's slow crawl. The wind sharpened, cutting through trees and stone with a whisper that spoke of winter's approach. Even the birds, once frequent visitors to the Lazar house roof, had flown south, their nests abandoned among the rafters. Inside the crumbling chapel, the fire burned low, and the trio huddled closer each night. They had become something of a rhythm, a strange, stitched-together family, bound not by blood, but by the weight of what they had survived. Each day had its quiet tasks, gathering wood from the grove, clearing debris from the fallen cloisters, collecting berries and nettle where they grew stubborn among the ruins. But there was another rhythm too, a quieter one, a pulse beneath the surface of their days. Tomas felt it first. It began as a sensation, hardly noticeable at all. The stillness in the mornings that seemed too deep, the forest sounds that died too quickly, the way crows now watched from branches without cawing. There were no footprints, no signs of presence, but Tomas had lived too long in the margins of civilization not to recognize the feeling of being watched. He didn't tell the others at first, not because he wished to be brave, but because he feared making it real. Words had weight. Once spoken, they hung in the air like smoke. Instead, he listened. He began rising before the others, moving silently among the trees, observing the paths that ran near the Lazar house. He walked further than he usually dared, circling the perimeter, watching for any sign, broken branches, displaced stones, remnants of boot prints. And then, one morning, he found it. Tied to a tree near the edge of the glade, just where the brush began to thicken, was a length of frayed cloth. At first it appeared accidental, a forgotten shred of tunic or traveller's wrap. But when he stepped closer, Tomas saw the knot. Intentional, purposeful, a mark. He didn't touch it. Instead, he turned back and walked slowly to the chapel where Osric and Anwen were eating. "We're not alone anymore," he said. Anwen paused, hand mid-air with a slice of bread. Her eyes met his and she didn't ask for proof, she simply nodded. Osric glanced between them, mouth still chewing, then swallowed hard. "The manor?" Tomas said. "Something else." He didn't know what exactly, and that was what troubled him. There were many kinds of people who walked the wild places between villages, some kind most indifferent, and a few dangerous. Bandits moved quietly when they wanted to, outlaws even more so. But this felt different. The knot was not meant to warn, nor to trap, it was a signal. But to whom? That night, they banked the fire early. They kept no lantern lit, no ember glowing in the window's reach. The Lazar house became a black silhouette under a pale, moon-washed sky. Tomas did not sleep. He sat near the door, a stick in hand, sharpened at one end. It was not a weapon meant for battle, but it might slow someone down. That was enough. The night passed with no sound save for wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. But in the morning, as he stepped outside to stretch the ache from his limbs, Tomas found something that made his stomach twist. A stone placed carefully on the chapel's threshold, flat and round, with a line scratched into its surface, a single horizontal cut. He picked it up slowly. It was warm from the early sun. Someone was here, he said when the others joined him. Anwen looked at the stone. Is it a warning? Tomas shook his head. A message? What does it mean? He turned the stone over in his palm, thinking. I don't know yet. For the next 3 days they saw no one, but each morning another stone appeared. The second had 2 lines, vertical this time. The third bore a triangle, barely etched. The fourth was smooth, clean, no markings at all. Osric grew anxious. He muttered under his breath, glanced over his shoulder constantly and clutched a branch he had carved into a club. They're playing with us, he said. Whoever it is. Tomas wasn't sure. The stones weren't threats. They weren't curses or signs of mocking. If anything, they felt ritualistic, like signals passed between silent watchers. On the 5th day, Tomas left before the sun rose, moving quickly toward the tree where he had first seen the knotted cloth. It was gone now, but something else had taken its place. A pouch hanging low and half hidden among the branches. Inside it were 3 things: a sprig of rosemary, a scrap of leather with a bird carved into it, and a broken arrowhead. He brought it back. Anwen stared at the items for a long while, then said quietly, It's a code, an old one. You know it? Tomas asked. No, she said. But my grandmother did. She said there were people in the woods who spoke without words. Wanderers. Ones who don't stay in any one place. They used symbols, left signs. She said they were once called the kindred. Tomas raised a brow. That just sounds like another word for thieves. Anwen shrugged. Maybe, but not cruel ones. They help the lost sometimes. Osric scoffed. Or lured them out. Still, that night, Tomas left something at the edge of the forest. A response. He tied 3 twigs into a triangle and placed it beneath the tree where the pouch had hung. He said nothing to the others. In the morning, the triangle was gone. In its place was bread. Real bread. Still warm. Osric stared at it like it might explode. Tomas broke it open. Inside, nestled in the middle of the loaf, was a folded piece of parchment. It was old, the ink faded, but the lines were clear. Shelter kept is shelter shared. Fire drawn is warmth owed. The silent house is watched. There was no signature, no name, but Anwen touched the edge of the parchment like it was sacred. They're offering something, she murmured. A pact, maybe. Tomas didn't know what kind of people left bread and omens in the dark, but he knew this much. In a world as cruel as theirs, any hand that reached out without a knife in it deserved attention. He looked at Osric, then Anwen. We'll wait, he said, and we'll watch. And from that moment on, the Lazar house no longer belonged only to them. It became something else, a point on a map of secrets, a place known to eyes they had never met, and hearts that still beat in the silence. The forest changed after that. It was a slow transformation, not one marked by sudden movements or blazing signs, but a shift that lived in the corners of things. A small pile of pine cones placed deliberately on the path, a tuft of wool tied to a low branch, fresh boot prints in the mud where none had been the day before. Always alone, never clustered, never careless. It was as though the woods had grown new eyes. Tomas noticed it most when walking the southern edge of the glade, where the moss grew thick over fallen trees, and the air always carried the scent of wet bark. Once, it had been the loneliest place near the Lazar house, quiet to the point of haunting. Now it hummed, not with noise, but with presence, with breath. One morning, he found a set of carved stones at the base of an old yew tree, each one painted with a stripe of red dye, the colour rich and earthy. The markings were simple, geometric, circles, crescents, slashes. He didn't touch them, he only memorized them. When he returned to the Lazar house, Anwen sat by the fire, weaving nettle cord through an old, torn satchel. "They left more signs," he said. Osric looked up from his perch by the window, frowning. "Why keep dancing around us? If they mean us no harm, why not just show themselves?" Tomas shrugged. "Maybe they're waiting to see if we're worth the risk. Or maybe they're the ones watching for danger. If we say the wrong word, strike the wrong spark." "They'd have done it already," Anwen said, not looking up. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension, not fear, but readiness. They kept the chapel swept, the well clean, the fire low but steady. Tomas noticed how their behaviours had shifted. Anwen placed her shoes outside each night. Soles turned upward. Osric stopped using the sharp whistle he once blew to call them back from the trees. Even Tomas, without meaning to, began sleeping closer to the centre of the room, away from windows, closer to the fire. Then, on the 12th morning, they arrived, not with footsteps, not with greetings, simply presence. Tomas stepped outside to find a woman sitting on the broken stone wall that once separated the chapel grounds from the forest beyond. She was not old nor young. Her face was weathered, not from age but from wind, smoke and distance. Her cloak was pieced together from so many colours it seemed to move even when she sat still, and around her neck hung a small bundle of bones tied together with red string. Tomas froze. She did not. "Hello," she said, voice low but kind. "I'm not here to take." Anwen appeared behind him, silent as a breath. Osric followed a beat later, his jaw tight. "I'm called Mir," the woman said, glancing at each of them in turn. "Of the kindred." Tomas nodded slowly. "We've heard the name." "I know, we've been watching." She said it not as a threat, not even as a warning, simply a fact. "What do you want?" Osric asked. Mir tilted her head. "To see if this place still breathes." Anwen stepped forward. "It does." Mir smiled, a faint curl of the lips. Not joy. Recognition. That day everything changed again. Mir didn't stay long, but when she left she said others would come. Not to live, not to settle, but to pass through, to rest. The kindred, she explained, did not stay anywhere for long. They moved like clouds, heavy with memory, silent with understanding. But they remembered their sanctuaries, and once, long ago, the Lazar house had been one. "There are few places left," she said before she disappeared into the trees. "Most are burned or claimed. This one was forgotten, but you remembered it." They were not alone again after that. Every few days, a stranger would arrive, never with noise, never with demands. A woman carrying a bundle of nettle and herbs, seeking warmth for the night. A man with one arm and a cloak full of dried fish, offering two in trade for shelter. A girl no older than Tomas had been when he first ran, silent and pale, holding only a carved figure in her hand, a bear worn at the edges. They came, they stayed a night or two, and they left. But in their wake, they left things behind. A better roof beam, a carved ladle, a pouch of salt, firewood dry and stacked, a jar of lard, a sack of barley, a pile of warm rags stitched into the shape of a blanket. None of it was spoken about. No one asked for thanks. The Lazar house, once broken, now breathed with quiet purpose. Tomas kept a small ledger scratched into the back of a wooden plank. He didn't know why, perhaps to remember, perhaps to honour. He carved their names if they gave them. If not, he etched a symbol, a feather, a coin, a flame, something they had carried, something they had left. Osric still watched them carefully, but the tightness in his voice eased. Anwen began collecting herbs again, pressing them between pages of an old book someone had brought and left behind. And Tomas? He began to believe in the space they had built. Not as shelter, but as haven. It was near winter's door when another stranger arrived, not with soft footfall or quiet humility there, but with a stumble and a cough that scraped the lungs like broken glass. They found him just beyond the edge of the glade, collapsed in the mud, face pale, fever rising from his skin in waves. His clothes were torn, not from travel but from violence. They carried him in, careful not to wake him, laid him beneath the altar, wrapped him in every spare cloth they had, and boiled water with herbs Tomas didn't know the names of. He drifted in and out of fevered sleep for 2 days. When he finally opened his eyes, they were sharp, terrified. He grabbed Tomas's wrist and croaked, "They're coming! Who?" He didn't answer, only coughed again, blood this time. That night, Thomas stood at the edge of the glade and watched the trees, and for the first time since they had claimed the Lazar house, he felt something he hadn't known he could feel anymore. Dread. The frost came early that year. By the 3rd week of October, the earth had hardened underfoot, and the well at the La house steamed faintly in the mornings, the last breath of warmth fleeing from the water below. Leaves no longer crunched under their boots, but clung to the earth like damp skin. The trees stood bare, skeletal. The sky stayed close, low-hanging and grey, as though pressing down with its silence. And in that silence, danger grew. The sick man slept fitfully in the back corner of the chapel. His name, they learned only on the 4th night, was Willen. He'd been a courier for one of the lesser barons in the lowlands, a runner between keeps and market towns. His words, when they came, were cracked and fever-worn, but clear enough to stir the cold in Thomas's spine. "They're hunting," Willen rasped. "Not just outlaws, not just thieves. Anyone not bound to a name or a banner." Anwen leaned close. "You mean?" "Wanderers," he coughed. "Travellers. Kindred. All of them." He drifted again, unconscious. Thomas sat back, the candlelight flickering across his face. The others stared at him, waiting. He didn't speak for a long while. Outside, the wind pressed against the chapel walls like a beggar without hands. Later that night, after Anwen had coaxed Willen back into a quieter sleep and Osric had stoked the fire until the stones glowed red, Thomas crept to the edge of the woods. He listened, not for footsteps, not for dogs or men or steel, but for the absence of all those things. For the stillness that comes before storms. He found it. The world was holding its breath. When he returned, he found Mir waiting by the outer wall. She stood in the shadows like she belonged there, her cloak dusted with frost, her fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of a pack on her shoulder. She did not look surprised to see him. "We've heard," she said softly. "You believe him? We don't need to. We've seen it." She looked past him to the crumbling chapel where faint candlelight danced behind cracked stained glass. "They're calling it a cleansing," she said, "to make the roads safe again." "Safe for whom?" "For the ones who already own everything." Mir reached into her cloak and pulled out a folded square of parchment. She handed it to Thomas. Inside was a map, hand-drawn but precise. It showed the southern villages and forest trails, the rivers and lesser roads, but more than that it bore marks, circles, crosses, flame symbols. "This," she said, tapping a series of marks near the forest line, "is where they burned out 3 shelters. One had children." Thomas swallowed. "We thought we had time," she said. "We thought winter would slow them. But they've planned this. Are they close?" She nodded. 3 days, maybe less. A patrol. 10 men, maybe more. Armed. On orders. Orders from who? From those who think peace is easier to build when no one's left to speak against them. She turned to go. But before she disappeared into the frost, she looked back and said, "This place, your place, it's become more than you know. People whisper about it. They say it's safe." "It was," Thomas said. "It still can be," she replied. "But not if you wait for the fire to find you." Then she was gone. Thomas stood alone beneath the black trees, the map heavy in his hands. He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he had made his decision. They would not run. He gathered Osric and Anwen beneath the broken arch where the altar once stood and spread the map on a flat stone. He told them everything. What Mir had said, what Wellen had confirmed, the march, the cleansing. Osric stood quickly, anger flashing in his eyes. "We can't stay," he said. "They'll burn us alive." "They'll burn the house," Anwen added, "even if we're gone." Thomas nodded. "Which is why we can't just run," Osric paced. "So we do what? Fight?" "No, but we don't wait." They began that afternoon. First, they cleaned every broken stone, every loose beam. The brush around the chapel was cut back, revealing lines of sight, narrowing the places someone might approach unseen. They dug shallow trenches at the edge of the glade, not to trap but to guide movement, to direct anyone who came where they could be seen. Then they prepared the messages. Thomas carved them on bark, on wood, on stone. Warnings, directions, signals for the kindred, for anyone who still moved quietly through the wilds. They used the language taught by the forest. Knots, marks, twigs broken and laid in patterns. "Smoke rises too fast to be the only alarm," Anwen had said. "Let the earth speak before the fire does." On the second day, others arrived. 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all marked by travel. One bore a scar across his cheek so deep it gleamed white in the moonlight. They said nothing at first, only nodded as though they already knew what needed to be done. By sunset, they were digging, not graves, not escape routes, defences, no weapons, no open battle, but barriers. Thorn hedges dragged close and woven tight. Stones piled into low walls, mirrors fashioned from burnished tin hung to catch the faintest movement in the underbrush. Silent things, thoughtful things. They worked by hand, by instinct. Each hour passed with urgency. By the third night, Willan was strong enough to sit upright. He watched the others with a strange smile, weak but bright. "You've made it a fortress," he whispered. Tomas shook his head. "We've made it matter." The next morning, the sky turned white. Snow fell, thin, dry, quiet, the first breath of winter. They stood together beneath the arch as it drifted down around them, dusting cloaks and stone. The Lazar house had never looked so still, so ready. Osric clutched his club. Anwin tied her cloak tight, eyes steady. Tomas turned toward the trees. They were coming. He knew it. The forest had grown quiet again, but something had changed. This time the silence was not fear, it was waiting. By dawn on the fourth day, the snow had settled thick across the forest paths, softening every edge and muffling every sound. The trees looked heavier now, bowed beneath the white as though grieving in silence. Tomas stood at the outer wall, staring into the tree line where the world ended in mist. No movement. Not yet. But he felt it in his spine, the same way one senses rain before the sky opens, or the stillness before a blade drops. Behind him, the Lazar house murmured with quiet preparation. Osric was wrapping iron nails in strips of cloth and dipping them in resin, laying them out like teeth beside the fire to harden. Anwin had filled every container they owned with water, melting snow over the coals and lining the chapel's edges with buckets and bowls. The others, the strangers who had come and stayed, reinforced the last of the barriers with stone and thorn, laying twisted branches across the footpaths that led to the chapel's door. No one spoke more than they needed to. Words were saved now for orders, for signals, for the end of things. Tomas moved along the perimeter, checking the traps, not to maim, but to warn. Cans strung with wire, branches suspended above paths that would drop and snap when disturbed. Simple things, crude, but they might buy seconds, and seconds, he knew, could be everything. By noon a sound came, not a horn, not a voice, the clop of a hoof, distant, deliberate, then another, then silence again. He returned quickly to the chapel. "They're close," he said. No one asked how he knew. Instead, Anwin rose, placed her hand on Willan's shoulder and whispered, "Stay down, say nothing." He nodded. He was pale again, the fever still lurking behind his eyes, but his grip on the knife they'd given him was firm. A dagger once meant for bread, now something heavier. Osric climbed to the loft where the shattered window gave view over the hill. Two of the others took their places at the side alcove, watching the flanks. Tomas took the front. He stood beneath the arch of the ruined chapel, the great oak doors long gone, the stones behind him whispering of prayers once spoken. He did not carry a weapon. He carried the ledger, the carved board where he had scratched the names and symbols of all who had come, all who had stayed. It hung from his shoulder like a shield. The snow fell slower now, in thick, slow spirals, and then from the white beyond, the first shape emerged, a rider, broad-shouldered, cloaked in black wool, a crest embroidered on his chest, not of nobility but of function, a burning branch crossed with a sword. Behind him came another, and then three more, 7 in total, on foot. One with a torch, 2 with pikes, all clad in layers of boiled leather and furs, expressions unreadable. The lead rider stopped, 10 paces from Tomas. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, finally, the rider's voice, low and sharp. "This is unclaimed land." Tomas said nothing. "This structure is abandoned." Still, no reply. "You are not authorized to dwell here, nor to shelter others." Tomas stepped forward once, just enough that his breath could be seen. He reached up and took the ledger from his shoulder, held it in both hands, and let it hang between them like an offering. "It is claimed," he said softly, "by us." The rider's brow twitched. "It is holy land," Tomas continued, "once a refuge for the sick, for the broken, and it has become that again." The man didn't move, but the torchbearer behind him shifted, adjusting his grip. One of the pikemen planted his weapon in the snow with a soft thunk. "There's no lord to vouch for you," the rider said. "We don't need a lord. No charter, no seal, no coin." "No chains," Tomas replied. "No master, just people." The rider's eyes narrowed. "You defy order." "No," Tomas said. "We reject cruelty." For a moment, the forest held its breath again. The rider stepped from his horse. He walked forward slowly, crunching snow beneath his boots, until he stood only a few paces from Tomas. He was taller, stronger. His cloak carried the scent of fire, not hearth, but destruction. "I have burned 3 places like this in the last month," he said. "One had children." Tomas's voice shook now, but he did not lower the ledger. "If you light a fire here," he said, "you will find the smoke chokes you before it reaches the trees." The rider's face flickered, something between amusement and disdain. "Is that a threat?" "No," Tomas said. "It's a truth." Behind him, he heard the quiet scuff of boots. Anwen now stood at the chapel door, Osric behind her. Others lined the edges of the ruin, no weapons raised, no cries of war, just presence, witness. The rider turned his head slightly, taking it in. 10 of you?" 15, Anwen corrected, her voice clear. 20 by nightfall, Osric added. It was a lie, but a good one. The rider exhaled, cold clouded around his mouth. "You've chosen your path then," he said. "We've chosen each other," Tomas replied. Another long moment passed. The snow began again in earnest, soft and insistent. Finally, the rider turned. He walked back to his horse, mounted without flourish, and looked once more toward the ruin. "This will not stand," he said. Tomas didn't answer. The patrol disappeared into the woods. No one moved for a long time. Then, slowly, the others returned inside. Tomas stayed beneath the arch until the snow covered the last of the hoofprints. Then, with hands trembling not from fear, but from something else, something deeper, he hung the ledger back on the wall above the altar and carved a new mark, a flame crossed with a branch, but not burning. Not this time. This time it stood. The days that followed passed like smoke, slow to rise, slow to vanish. The snow deepened, covering every path, every footprint, until the forest stood blank and silent again. But beneath that hush, the world had changed. The Lazar house endured. The patrol did not return. Not that day, not the next. No torches came flickering through the trees, no iron boots cracked the frost beneath the chapel walls. The fire remained unlit for 3 nights, just in case. And the voices inside stayed low. But the tension eased, little by little, like Thor bleeding slowly into frozen wood. They didn't celebrate. There was no feast, no song, just quiet glances, softer movements, the slow return of ordinary tasks. Willen recovered more fully. He still walked with a limp and his cough lingered in the cold, but his eyes were clearer now. He helped where he could, gathering kindling, boiling snow, cleaning the stones of the chapel floor until they shone dull and steady in the lantern light. "I've been to places," he told Tomas one evening, "but none like this." "Like what?" "Alive," Welland said. "It feels alive here, like it wants us here." Tomas didn't know if places could want, but something in the Lazar house had changed. Not the walls, not the roof, but the air inside. It no longer echoed. It absorbed sound, gently, like a home. By midwinter, more people had come. Not in large groups, never more than 2 or 3, and never loud. They brought things with them, worn tools, seeds in pouches, bits of wax, wool, herbs, even a pan with a bent handle. Some stayed a night, some stayed longer. A few didn't leave at all. There was Mirren, a woman in her 60s who had once delivered babies in the marsh towns. She barely spoke at first, but by her 2nd week she had converted the chapel's southern alcove into a sort of healing corner, with mosses and cloth and honey wrapped in cheesecloth. She tended Willen's cough with a concoction so bitter it made his eyes water, but it worked. Then there was Jun, a boy no older than 10 who arrived with an older girl, Freya, who might have been his sister or might have simply found him along the road. She didn't say, and no one asked. Jun rarely spoke, but he carved figures out of bark, birds, trees, wolves with long curling tails. He left them on window sills, balanced on fence posts tucked into nooks like blessings. One evening, Freya took Tomas aside and said he hadn't spoken for a year, but he called this place a house. That was the first word I'd heard. Tomas looked at the little wolf carved in his hand. "It is," he said. "Now." And perhaps that was the strangest part of all. Without plan, without ruler or stone-cut blueprint, the Lazar house became something more than a refuge. It became a village. A hidden one, yes, a fragile one. But a village nonetheless. They made paths in the snow between buildings, laid straw in the cracks to keep out the wind. A rope stretched between the chapel and the outer shed. where food stores were kept, a lifeline when snowstorm whiteouts buried the world in blindness. Children made snow bricks and built low walls that they called watch forts, pretending they were the guardians of the forest. And the adults, perhaps because they had once dreamed such things too, let them believe it. Still, they remained cautious. The outer traps stayed in place. The signal stones were checked twice each day. The woodpile was kept discreet. No smoke during daylight, only when the mist was thick or the sky wept with. A system of bells was fashioned from tin cups, hung on string along the edge of the glade. If disturbed, they would chime once, just enough. Osric grew into his role as a watchman. He no longer flinched at shadows. His eyes were sharp, his shoulders broader. He had carved a staff, smooth and strong, and wore it like an extension of himself. He never called himself a protector, but no one ever passed the glade without Osric knowing first. Anwen, quiet as ever, had begun keeping a journal of what plants they could still find even under frost. Lichen, pine resin, the soft moss beneath certain stones. She boiled teas with mint and bark that soothed coughs and eased sleep. She wore a necklace now, not of gold, but of small wooden beads strung together by children. A gift, perhaps, or a promise. As for Tomas, he had stopped thinking of himself as the boy beneath the butcher's awning. That boy was a ghost now, living somewhere in the echoes of his dreams. He was still lean, still quiet, but his hands no longer trembled when the wind blew. He had learned to split wood with a single motion, to bind wounds with cloth and salt, to speak not with pride but with calm. He had become something no one had called him before, a leader, not because he claimed it, but because others listened. One night, as the stars spilled over the snow in silver silence, Mir returned. She stepped from the woods like always, her cloak powdered with frost, her hair dusted with the smell of pine and thyme. She smiled when she saw Tomas and said, "They speak of this place in the southern woods, the house that breathes." "We're still here," he replied. "I know, and others know too." They sat by the hearth that night, Mir speaking in a low voice of distant movements, of lords arguing over borders, of new taxes levied on travellers, of roads barred without warning, of how the word vagrant had become a sentence, and how many sought places where names did not carry chains. "More will come," she said. "We'll make room." She looked at him, long and hard. "Are you ready for that? When it's not just the wounded, but the angry? When it's not just the broken, but the hunted?" Tomas didn't answer at first. He looked around the chapel, at the lanterns made of waxed cloth, at the shelves built from broken pews, at June's little wolf resting near the hearth, at the shoes lying neatly beside the wall, at Willen, sleeping again, safe, at Anwen and Osric, sitting by the window, speaking softly about nothing at all. And then he looked back to Mir. "We were all hunted once," he said. "We've just stopped running." Outside, the wind had died completely, and for the first time in many weeks, the snow had stopped falling. By late winter, the snow had become a fixture, not a storm to be endured, but a companion that lay across the world in hush and grace. It pressed against the walls of the Lazar house like an old quilt, softening every edge, dulling every sound. At night, it shimmered blue beneath the moonlight, and by day it glowed faintly gold, as if the sun itself were reluctant to let go of the horizon. Inside, life was still and quiet, but not idle. The people of the Lazar house had fallen into rhythm, not one imposed by rule or command, but shaped by need, by care, by the soft hands of routine. The mornings began with breath clouds and the rustle of wool. Osric, always first to wake, made the rounds with his staff, checking the bell wires, the traps, the snow depth at the forest's edge. He recorded what he saw on a small slate board hung near the chapel door, sun signs for clear skies, slashes for prints, swirls for wind. He had become the village's eyes, and no one questioned the markings he made. Anwen tended to warmth. She kept the fires fed, the children washed, the coughs soothed. She had a way of knowing when someone needed hot tea even before they did, or when a restless child needed the small comfort of a carved toy, or a stone warmed in the coals and slipped beneath a blanket. No one asked her how she knew, they just trusted her. Tomas moved among them, never fast, never loud. His hands mended what broke, buckles, door hinges, a cracked bowl. He listened more than he spoke, answered questions with gestures, and made decisions like a stone sinking into still water, without splash, but felt all the same. The Lazar house was not a town. It had no name on any map, no walls of stone or guard towers, no banner flapping in the wind. But it had the things that mattered. Trust, bread, warmth, the slow, deliberate grace of survival, shared. And that winter, as word spread, more came. A family of 4, once tenant farmers, arrived with nothing but frost-bitten fingers and a mule that could barely stand. They had lost everything, not to war, not to sickness, but to silence. Their landlord had vanished. Their field had been claimed. Their names removed from records by a new steward with a pen and no conscience. They were given a place beside the old cloister wall. The children were given mittens. The mule was fed oats and wrapped in wool and rubbed down by Freya until its ears twitched again. Then came an old mason, half blind, who had once built bridges in the north. He carried a satchel of tools and a broken leg that had never healed right. In exchange for food and a warm place to rest, he taught the others how to seal the chapel's gaps with packed earth and straw, how to stack stones so they wouldn't shift, how to build a proper chimney that drew smoke rather than choking it back. And then came a midwife, a girl barely 20, with calloused hands and eyes that looked older than any of them. She wore a cloak dyed black with soot and told them, without fanfare, that she had delivered 15 babes by candlelight, 4 in barns, 2 on riverbanks. "I don't ask for a place," she said, "only a corner." Tomas nodded. "You'll have more than that." Each new arrival brought with them the weight of a story, but not always the words. Sometimes they brought only silences, long, hollow silences that hung behind their shoulders like cloaks too heavy to remove. But even those in time grew lighter, and in return, each one left something behind. A repaired bucket, a tune hummed softly while working, a way of stacking firewood to dry it faster. The Lazar house grew not in walls or towers, but in memory, in method, in the 1,000 small kindnesses that made it stronger. Still, they never forgot what lay beyond the trees. The patrols did not return, but others did. Merchants, armed riders, even a travelling priest who came in early February with hollow cheeks and a sermon in his throat. He had been turned out of his own parish, he claimed, for speaking mercy over obedience. Tomas let him in. The man preached once beneath the broken chapel roof, not with fire or threats, but with a quiet voice and frost on his beard. "There is holiness," he said, "in defiance done with love." They fed him broth. He left the next day with mittens and a bell to warn of wolves. By mid-February, the snow began to soften, just slightly. Water dripped from the eaves in slow rhythm. The stream behind the chapel cracked, then murmured. The trees shook themselves awake, branches twitching in the breeze. But peace, like snow, never lasts untouched. It began with a fire. Far to the west, a flicker of orange stained the night sky low on the horizon. Osric saw it first from the chapel loft and stood without blinking for nearly an hour. When he came down, he said only, "A village is gone." The next day, refugees came. Not many, 6 in total. Hollow-eyed, their boots burned. One girl's dress was singed at the hem. They spoke of soldiers without crests, men who claimed no flag, only obedience to order. They said we were squatters, one of them whispered, that the land was never ours. They took what we had, then they took the roof. The room fell still. Mia returned the day after, soaked with mud, her hair in a tight braid down her back. "They've moved north," she said, "but they're watching." "Us?" Tomas asked. "Not just. All of us. This place, places like this. They don't understand them." "Why?" Mia looked toward the window where June's latest carving, a fox poised mid-leap, rested on the sill. "Because they didn't build it, and they don't know how to break it." That night, Thomas lay beneath the rafters, eyes open to the faint flicker of stars beyond the glassless window. The fire had gone to embers. Anwen's soft breathing drifted from the opposite corner. Osric's coat hung neatly on the peg. The chapel walls whispered in the wind. The world would change again. He felt it. They would come. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next moon, but they would come. And when they did, the Lazar house would not meet them with torches or blades or chants of vengeance. It would meet them with its truth. A place made not of power, but of care, of endurance, of the quiet refusal to vanish. The first green appeared in the smallest places, not in the trees, still stripped and skeletal, not in the fields, still buried under frost, but in the moss, thickening along the edges of the wellstones, damp and vivid, in the curls of ivy that dared push from beneath the chapel's foundations, in the soft shoots that sprang from cracks in old barrels where warmth lingered longest. Spring had not yet arrived, not truly, but it had sent a message, and the Lazar house listened. The snow began to retreat in shy patches, leaving behind dark, wet earth that smelled of promise. Smoke rose more freely now, the fear of watchful eyes softened by the changing wind. The people no longer huddled as tightly at night. They opened windows where shutters had once been nailed shut. They let the cold air in just for a moment and breathed it like hope. Thomas stood one morning by the edge of the woods, watching sunlight drip through branches like melted glass. The forest was waking, so were the dangers that slept inside it. But something else stirred too, a movement not of threat, but of growth. Mir returned with 3 more people, lean and road-worn, but smiling. They had come from the south, where old trade towns were quietly reawakening, not by order of lords, but by need, by kindness. Places where no taxes were levied, where bread was traded for linen and silence was met with warmth rather than suspicion. "There are others," she said to Thomas, "scattered but rising, quiet roots beneath the surface. They're asking about the house." "What do they ask, if it's real?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Tell them it is, but not because of me." The chapel had changed again. It was still crumbling, still cracked, still cold when the fire went out, but its bones were stronger now, the beams repaired, the leaks patched with tar and bark, the alcoves filled with blankets and baskets and dried herbs wrapped in linen. What had once been only refuge had become routine. What had been survival was now a kind of life. And then, one afternoon, a child was born. Her name was Brenna. She came into the world during a rainstorm, as if summoned by it, her cries thin and fierce and certain. The young midwife, the girl in soot-stained robes, brought her forth with hands steady as stone. Her mother wept not with pain, but with disbelief. She had expected the road, or the grave, or silence. But instead, she held a daughter. The entire house shifted that day. Not outwardly, not with celebration or song, but with breath. The fire burned longer, the walls felt warmer. And when Thomas stepped outside and looked toward the trees, the world no longer seemed to lean inward with hunger. It leaned outward, curious. People came not just with questions now, but with things to give. A sack of seeds, onion, barley, cabbage, a box of beeswax candles, a cart of river stones for paving the muddy paths, a spindle, a blade sharpener, a broken fiddle, and a man who promised he could play it once it sang again. They didn't ask for space. They simply asked to belong. No one was turned away, not even the boy with the thief's eyes. He came one morning in an early thaw, dripping wet and thin as a reed. He had a scar down his left cheek and hands that trembled, not from fear, but from hunger and cold. He didn't speak, not even when offered bread. Osric found him curled near the shed. "He hasn't said a word," he murmured to Thomas. "Doesn't meet my eyes." Thomas walked over slowly, sat beside the boy in the damp straw. "You don't have to speak," he said. "But you're safe here. You don't have to believe me right away. Just rest." The boy didn't move, but he didn't run. By the next morning, the bread was gone, and the boy had taken a blanket to his shoulders. A week later, he was helping stack firewood. No one asked his name. They would wait for it to come. One night, Thomas returned to the ledger. The old plank had grown full. Its carvings stretched edge to edge, names, symbols, tiny pictures of trees and fire and hands. He stared at it for a long time. Then he went outside into the starlight and began carving a second board. This time he left a space at the top. Anwen found him there hours later, hands stiff with cold, eyes soft. "You'll run out of wood," she said. "I hope so." They sat in silence for a while, the stars wheeling slowly overhead. "What happens if they come back?" she asked finally. "The soldiers, the lords, what happens when they stop tolerating what we've built?" Thomas looked toward the trees. "They already don't understand it," he said. "But they'll come anyway, because this isn't theirs." He paused, his breath hung like fog. "But it's real now. It's not a hiding place. It's a beginning. And when something begins, it changes the things around it, whether they want to change or not." Anwen nodded slowly. "And if they burn it, then we build again." Her eyes met his. "Even if it's just ashes?" "Especially then." Later that night, June placed a new carving in the centre of the chapel, a bird with wings outstretched. It was made from driftwood and shaped with care, its feathers splayed like it had caught the moment just before flight. No one touched it. but all of them looked. Spring had not yet arrived, not fully, but already it was being born in places no map could name. When the spring finally came, it did not announce itself with trumpet or storm. It came in moments. The first was a morning breeze that smelled of earth, not smoke. The second, a scatter of yellow petals drifting across the glade like they had forgotten the trees they once clung to. The third, a bee, fat and drowsy, hovering above the chapel stones, its lazy hum louder than any church bell had ever rung. And just like that, the world softened. The paths, once buried in snow and silence, became rivers of mud and blooming weeds. Moss crept up every wall. Tiny flowers erupted in places no one had planted them. The sun returned with gentler hands, warming wood and skin and water, coaxing even the most stubborn seeds to crack open and try again. Inside the Lazar house, everything shifted. Children ran without coats now, their laughter rising like steam into the rafters. Osric shed his winter furs and carved a new staff from ashwood, taller, smoother, stronger. He spent more time by the edge of the forest, marking trees, learning the new routes as the snow receded and trails returned. Anwen planted herbs in clay pots lined along the chapel windows. She whispered to them when no one watched, her fingers buried in dirt, her voice as steady as the river thawing behind the shed. Jun, ever quiet, had begun building strange little towers from pebbles and sticks. He placed them in a circle near the well, each one different, none more than a hand high. For the spirits, he said once, and no one questioned him. Tomas walked the edge of it all, his eyes always scanning, not for threat, but for change. He saw it in the people. They had grown, not just in number, though they had. Nearly 30 now in all. Some stayed only days. Others weeks. A few had decided never to leave. They built lean-tos from branches, patched old stone walls with clay and straw, turned broken barns into warm nests of reed and wool. The Lazar house was no longer a ruin with people inside. It was becoming a village, not planned, not charted, but alive. And with growth came questions. Small ones at first. Can we clear that field for planting? Who keeps watch when Osric is sick? Where should we put new food stores before the rains? Then larger. What do we do if someone steals? Who decides if we take more people in? Can this last? There were no scrolls, no laws, no wax seals. So they gathered beneath the arch of the chapel one evening as the first frogs began to sing from the thawing creek. They sat in a ring, adults and children alike. No hierarchy, no pedestal, just a fire in the centre and the flickering light on their faces. Tomas didn't speak first. Mir did. This place, she said softly, is not like others. It wasn't given to us, it wasn't paid for. It was built piece by piece out of what we carried, and that means we have to shape it with care, with weight. She looked around. So we speak. And they did. Each voice came slowly, like stepping onto a frozen lake, careful, unsure. But they held each other, no one mocked, no one shouted. They listened. They passed a carved stone between them, Jun's idea, and only the person holding it could speak. One by one, they built a shape for what they had. They agreed to trade by fairness, not value. To share food first with the sick, then with the children. To never refuse shelter for a single night, no matter who knocked. To speak truthfully when harm was done, and to mend it together. And to name no leader, but many guardians. By the time the fire died, something old had been reborn. Not law, not rule, but trust. An agreement carved not in stone, but in will. And so spring unfurled further. The first planting began in the western clearing, where the sun hit longest. Turnip, cabbage, a patch of barley shy and hopeful. They worked together, Tomas digging, Anwen pressing seeds, the children running between rows laughing, their footprints shaping the furrows. Old timber was hauled and split, fences were woven from branches and bark. A proper gate was made, not to keep people out, but to mark the boundary of safety. A sign was hung above it, carved by Osric in letters he had taught himself to write, the Lazar place. They debated names for days, but in the end it was Anwen who said quietly, "Let it be what it is, not a town, not a castle, a place." A place, it sounded humble, but it felt immense. There were trials still, of course, a night when wolves howled too close and everyone stayed inside, breath held until morning. A child fell into the creek and nearly drowned, pulled free only by Tomas's quick hands and Osric's steady grip. a quarrel between two new arrivals over a missing tool that turned to shouting before it was quieted by Mir's firm voice and Anwen's silent embrace. They made mistakes, missteps, but always they mended. One evening, Thomas sat alone beneath the chapel's broken window, looking out at the trees. The sun dipped behind them like a coin slipping beneath water. The wind smelled of ash and lilac. He held the second ledger in his lap, already half-carved with names and symbols. He traced the last mark he'd made, a bundle of leaves tied in twine. "Do you think it will last?" Mir asked, appearing beside him. Thomas didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the fields where children still played in the dusk, toward the gate where Osric leaned on his staff, watching the path with quiet eyes, toward the shed where June had built a new tower, taller than the rest. "It will," Thomas said softly, "as long as we do." Mir nodded, and for a while they said nothing more. But in that silence, the place they'd built pulsed with life, with memory, and with something more powerful than walls or words, a future. The summer came in gently, like a mother entering a sleeping child's room, barefoot, warm, careful not to stir too much all at once. The air thickened, scented with clover and sap and the musk of long afternoons. Birds returned in flocks, their calls weaving through the forest like a song forgotten by winter. Bees busied themselves at the edges of the glade, drawn to the herbs Anwen had planted in pots and boxes, and even in the hollowed stump by the well. She called them her guardians. The Lazar place grew quieter in some ways, louder in others. Children's laughter echoed from tree to tree. The sound of hammers and rope, of stones shifted and stacked, filled the mornings. By midday, most stopped their work to rest in the shade or wade ankle-deep in the stream. Bread rose in clay ovens built against the chapel's wall. Smoke curled slowly skyward, not in fear, but in rhythm. It was a season of breathing. But even peace carries its shadows. One afternoon, as the sun hung heavy and slow over the glade, a stranger came. He did not arrive by the path. He did not knock at the gate. He stood instead just beyond the line of bells, not crossing, not calling out. Watching. Osric was the first to see him, seated on the chapel roof, patching the last winter cracks with pine pitch. He called down and Thomas came. Then Anwen. Then Mir, quiet but steady. The stranger remained still, his arms loose at his sides. He wore no armour, but his cloak was fine, a deep blue rarely seen among wanderers. A sword hung at his hip, clean and kept. His boots were too new, his eyes too calm. Thomas stepped beyond the bell line. "You've found something few know how to find," he said. "I was shown," the man replied. "By whom?" The man gestured vaguely toward the woods. "Voices travel, stories too. You carry a blade." "I haven't drawn it yet," the man smiled faintly. "Would it help if I dropped it?" "No," Thomas said. "It wouldn't change the weight of your silence." They stood a moment longer, two figures in a sunlit standoff, not enemies, not allies, not yet. Then the man said, "I serve no banner." Thomas raised a brow. "Used to. Not now. They don't like what I know." "And what's that?" The stranger's voice lowered. "That the world isn't holding anymore, not like it was. Lords fight ghosts, peasants dig graves, priests sing to half-empty pews. And here, in the places no one watches, something new is rising." He looked toward the Lazar place then, toward the houses, the gardens, the hanging lines of laundry, the carved stones, the fire pit, the gate. "It doesn't smell like fear," he said. "That's rare." Thomas nodded once. "You're not wrong. May I enter?" "Not today." The man didn't argue. He stepped back from the bell line one pace only. "When the time comes," he said softly, "they'll want to destroy this. Not because it's dangerous, but because it proves they aren't necessary." Thomas said nothing. The man turned and walked back into the forest. For a long while, no one spoke. Then Osric said from his perch on the chapel roof, "I don't like the way he looked at us, like a cartwright admiring a wheel." Anwen murmured, "Or a hunter tracking a deer." Mir nodded. "He won't be the last." They doubled the watch that week, reinforced the gate, moved the food stores deeper underground. But more than that, they began writing. It was Mir's idea. "If they burn us," she said one night, "let the wind carry more than ash." So they gathered what paper they had, scraped parchment, slate, even bark, and they wrote. Thomas, in his slow, careful hand, told the story of the chapel, of the first stone he carved, and what it meant. Anwen wrote of the children, their games, their questions, the way they tied twine into knots like birds building nests from memories. Osric listed every path he had mapped, Every trail watched and walked, every tree he trusted and every one he didn't. Others joined in. Whelan wrote of his fever and the way warmth had felt like being forgiven. The midwife wrote of Brenna's birth, of how the cries of a new life had echoed through the broken rafters. Jun didn't write, but he carved. A panel of images. The chapel, the fire, the gates, the wolves, the strangers, the birth. His hands moved with purpose. With remembrance, they wrapped the writings in oilcloth, sealed them in wax jars and buried them beneath stones. Not for hiding, but for remembering. "They'll try to erase us," Mia said, "so we'll write louder than fire." And even as they prepared, they lived. That summer, 3 more children were born. 2 teeth fell out. 1 wedding was whispered into being beneath the moon. No priest, just promise. A fiddle was repaired. Songs were sung. The bees multiplied. The fields filled with green, real green, not survival green, but growing green, glowing green, a colour that did not ask permission to be alive. And one day, while walking along the outer path near the edge of the glade, Tomas found a bundle hanging from a tree. It was a pouch. Inside, a ribbon, a copper coin, a feather tied in red string, and a note. 5 words only. "We see, we remember. Soon." He closed the pouch, hung it back where it had been, then turned and walked home. The final summer days passed like golden dust falling through an open window, slow, radiant, easy to miss until suddenly the light changed. The mornings became cooler, the sun lower in the sky, the fields rustled with the first whispers of harvest. Apples grew heavy, wild mint bloomed and faded, and the bees, fat and full, flew slower now, their season's work nearly done. Inside the Lazar place, everything hummed with preparation. It was not panic, it was knowing. The world had turned once again, and with its turning came a quiet certainty. What had been built would be tested, not because it had failed, but because it had endured. One morning, before the sun fully crested the tree line, Tomas climbed the hill behind the chapel, the one they rarely visited. It was a small rise, overgrown with broom and thistle, but it offered a view of the whole place. From there, the Lazar place looked almost imagined. The chapel's bones were still visible, stone and timber wrapped in moss and ivy, but now it stood cradled by gardens, woven fences, and the soft curve of smoke drifting from ovens. Paths crossed like ribbons on a child's braid. People moved between them, carrying water, feeding hens, laughing. It did not look like resistance. It looked like life. Anwen joined him, a bundle of herbs in her arms. She stood beside him without speaking, her presence familiar as the wind. "Do you remember," she asked finally, "when we used to hide at night, just to light a fire?" Tomas nodded. "I remember thinking smoke would be the end of us." "It still could be." He turned to look at her. "But it won't," she added, her voice softer now, "because now someone would carry the coals and someone else would build again." They stood in silence as the breeze shifted through the grass, carrying the scent of rosemary and river mud. The sun touched the chapel roof then, turning the moss a brighter green. Below, June walked slowly toward the well, his shadow long, a bundle of wood in his arms. He had grown taller. All the children had. At midday, a visitor came. Not a soldier, not a stranger. It was a woman in a simple grey cloak, her hair bound in a leather cord, her hands calloused from travel. She walked with a limp, but without hesitation. Her face was lined with age, not cruelty. She carried a small pack, and she carried a question. They met her by the gate. "I heard there was a place," she said, "where stories survive." Tomas stepped forward. "We tell them here," he replied, "and we live them." The woman exhaled like someone letting go of a name long held too tightly. "May I stay?" she asked. He opened the gate. Yes. That evening, as the sun slid behind the western trees, a fire was lit in the centre of the glade, not for warning, not for fear, but for remembering. The people gathered slowly, carrying bowls of food, jugs of cider, loaves of fresh bread. They sat in circles. They passed stories. No declarations, no speeches, just the slow, warm rhythm of voices in the dark. Anwen told of a girl who once crossed a frozen river barefoot, chasing the sound of bells she didn't know were hers. Osric described the shape of a tree near the path, how it bent not from wind, but from always reaching toward a clearing where deer once slept. Jun said only this: "I made a fox out of clay, it cracked, I buried it. The next day, a real one watched me from the orchard." And Tomas, when the firelight turned soft and most were half asleep, he stood and spoke. "I used to believe that being seen was a kind of danger. that to survive was to stay small, quiet, forgotten. He looked around at them. But you taught me that memory isn't weight, it's thread. It binds, it sews, it carries us. He held up the ledger, now a third board nearly full. These are your names, your signs, your sparks. And if the world ever forgets us, truly forgets, then let it find this, and know we existed. They said nothing, but one by one they reached forward and touched the ledger, a finger, a thumb, a brush of a palm, and for a while no one moved. That night, Tomas walked to the edge of the glade alone. The moon hung low, the forest was silent. He thought of Jory, a boy lost to the stream, never found again. Of Marjorie, whose bones slept somewhere near a crumbled stone wall, under earth that no longer remembered her name. Of the others, the cold, the empty, the forgotten. He whispered to them. Not a prayer, but a welcome. You are here too. He turned back to the Lazar place, to the glow of firelight, to the roof of the chapel, now whole, to the breath of a village that had once been nothing. And then quietly he stepped inside.